one of the things that tilts me the most about Critical Role is the fan base. Longtime fans of Critical Role know that this dynamic or this reaction to conflict within the Critical Role Dungeons & Dragons game is nothing new. I mean, it seems like every single campaign there was at least one moment, I'm thinking of Bullgate in Campaign 2, where people just become way too invested in the story being told and seemingly forget that there are real human beings telling this story. And there's really nothing deeper to it than that. Critical Role, Dungeons & Dragons, and consequences in RP. Yeah, that's right. Today we're discussing Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 78, as last night's episode of Critical Role had the fan base acting absolutely unhinged. Now, for those of you who don't know, I am a massive Critical Role fan. I've basically been watching since day one. However, one of the things that tilts me the most about Critical Role is the fan base. Well, I guess I should really say a small vocal minority of the fan base, as last night's episode of Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 78, had people absolutely being unhinged in Twitch chat. So that's why in today's video, we're going to be discussing last night's episode of Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 78, and more importantly, discussing consequences in roleplay and Dungeons & Dragons. Honestly, I really should just take my own advice. If you want to enjoy every single episode of Critical Role, then just make sure you turn the chat off. So when we last left off in our story, our party had retrieved an ancient shard of a primordial titan, one similar to the one inside of our character Ashton, played by Taliesin. Now, Matt, as a dungeon master, had made a very pointed bit of information that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to put two of these spirits of a primordial titan inside of one body, basically telling Ashton, Taliesin's character, you probably shouldn't do this. Of course, in the last episode of Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 77, we saw to everyone's surprise that it was not Fern who would be taking this second shard of a primordial titan. Ashton decided to go for the double whammy. As our episode opens, to Ashton's surprise, and I think the surprise of many in the audience, he vomits up basically this shard of the primordial that they worked so hard last episode to make sure it got inside of him without killing him. And instantly, Twitch chat lost its mind. This instantly devolved, one side saying that finally Matt was giving consequences to characters' actions, which he never gives consequences according to these people. The other side saying that Matt's ruling here was completely unfair and Ashton got done dirty. It seems like last week a lot of people were upset that Matt allowed Ashton to absorb this primordial shard, many believing that this was a great risk and there needs to be consequences for failed actions. On the surface, these sentiments are relatively valid. A big part of Dungeons & Dragons in your roleplay is the consequences from your action. Now, obviously, consequences in Dungeons & Dragons in roleplay are extremely important, as these consequences create the stakes. They also do a good job to kind of create rails within a Dungeons & Dragons game, a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. If there's just no consequences from any of your actions, that's how you basically end up with a hobo murder party that just kill every problem that they come across and never face any kind of consequences to their actions. While I do think that sometimes these feelings are valid, sometimes Matt does go a little easy on the party. At the end of the day, though, this is their Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Matt is very much a dungeon master that will dish out consequences when consequences deserve to be dished out. If you've watched enough Critical Role, you've seen Matt hard punish his players when they need to be hard punished or given a reality check. Ultimately, though, at the end of the day, Matt, as a dungeon master, is more about furthering the overall story being told, the story being fleshed out between our characters. Personally, I think that it's insane and it's almost hilarious just watching these people get so upset. One, over a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Two, over a game that they are supposed to be watching for entertainment. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. In any mega major fan base, there's always going to be some unhinged people. I mean, just take the Game of Thrones fan base. People are always going to have an opinion on where a story should go, especially a story being told for entertainment in a show like Critical Role, but at the end of the day, this is Dungeons and Dragons. It's not a scripted story. This is a story that's being, adapted as it goes. Yes, Matt has a rough kind of map on where the story is going to go, but ultimately he is just responding to the actions of his players. Because of this, there's going to be things that happened in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, especially if you're watching it as entertainment, as basically a TV show. There's going to be things that happen that probably make you upset, or things that you just don't agree with, or things that just, yeah, you don't agree with on how it should have happened. One of the craziest things to me is that there were people in chat who genuinely believed that our cast members were actually like mad at each other over this situation in roleplay. Now, frankly, I think this is a major compliment, because this seems to mean that they were role-playing so well that literally dumbasses in the audience actually believed that they were mad at one another over something in a made-up fantasy game. Sometimes I really worry about people. I mean, like, how out of touch do you need to be to not realize that, like, what we're watching is roleplay? It's a performance. It's not people being passive-aggressive to one another. This is just absolutely unhinged behavior. Of course, it's completely fine to have an opinion on the direction of the story in Critical Role, or have an opinion on how Matt Mercer dungeon masters his game. I don't always agree with Matt's decisions. Sometimes I wish he was a little more heavy-handed in the pushing of consequences. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what my opinion is. I still watch the show, and I still completely enjoy it. And frankly, it blows my mind how people could have been upset or mad from anything from this episode, as this episode was absolutely insane. It was so good from a roleplay standpoint. While yes, Ashton may have gotten off a little lucky by not freaking dying from his poor decisions, but ultimately, without this poor decision in game, we wouldn't have had this awesome dynamic, this awesome roleplay, this conflict roleplay that, you know, was caused by it. It was the ultimate product of Ashton's decision. Longtime fans of Critical Role know that this dynamic, or this reaction to conflict within the Critical Role Dungeons & Dragons game, is nothing new. I mean, it seems like every single campaign there was at least one moment. I'm thinking of Bullgate in campaign 2. As I said before, consequences in roleplay in Dungeons & Dragons are extremely important. These consequences are what kind of ground our characters into the world. Without consequences, there really wouldn't be any stakes in a Dungeons & Dragons game, in a role-playing game. If that's the type of game you want to play, that's perfectly fine. Majority of the time, though, there need to be some kind of consequences, some kind of repercussions to actions that don't pan out accordingly. There is always going to be a section of the fan base that criticizes Matt for not being, I guess, harsh enough in his consequences. By that, I mean not murdering his players all the time. Ultimately, though, I think that Matt knows exactly what he's doing. He, as a dungeon master, he provides consequences in a very unique way, kind of outside of the box way that isn't just always straight up your character dies. And I think personally that's a good thing, especially when you're trying to tell a Dungeons and Dragons story that's literally streamed for hundreds of thousands of people. Ultimately, though, this episode, Campaign 3, Episode 78, was pretty good. It took a surprise turn when our party decided to take a trip to the Feywild to have a little day sabbatical, because wow, do these guys need some therapy. Over the last couple of episodes, Laudna is slowly diving and kind of spiraling out of control as Lady Delilah has again reemerged and seems to be really kind of worming her way into Laudna's mind. I really want to shout out like all of the cast here for their roleplay, but Marisha was just absolutely killing it this episode. I think she did an absolutely amazing job. She was really one of the highlights of this entire episode and some of the best role play from this episode. As I said, our party take a little sabbatical day in the Feywild, going to visit Fern's very scary grandmother, Nana Mori, the Fate Stitcher, a very scary, powerful hag. In these scenes, Matt teases us again with more secret kind of backstory hidden away for Fern, as Nana Mori says, your mother keeps a deep, dark secret, one you deserve to know. As well, Fern asks her mother about Asmodeus. As we remember weeks back, Fern was approached by a servant of Asmodeus to basically make a deal with Asmodeus. Fern as a character is super complicated, super interesting. There's all this mystery with Fern. Obviously, Fern is very hag-esque. We know that Fern is Ruidus born, and it seems likely that Fern's mother, Fern's parents, made some kind of deal with Nana Mori in some aspect. It seems like they traded Fern to Nana Mori, but it probably goes way deeper than that. Ultimately, this episode was very good, and I still can't wrap my mind around why people in Twitch chat, why people on Reddit got so upset from this episode. Genuinely, nothing happened that was controversial at all. This was people just getting mad because I guess roleplay happened and they didn't like how that roleplay went. Ultimately, there was repercussions for Ashton's actions, maybe in not the way that people hoped for, i.e. he didn't die, but he did get his constitution lowered permanently, and obviously his character is extremely emotionally scarred from the decision making that they did, essentially betraying, in some kind of a way, a decent amount of our party. To me, I don't know how you couldn't watch this episode and just sit back and be like, wow, this was a great episode that was literally all spurred on by, Talison's characters in-character decision-making and actions. Ashton making this dumb decision, this brazen decision, is what led to all of this awesome conflict roleplay. I don't know, I feel like I'm just rambling at this point. The Critical Role community is a really strange one sometimes. I know that it's a very vocal minority, at least I hope it's a very vocal minority, but there is like a weird amount of people in chat. I think this is just a roleplay phenomenon, as we see this in like other roleplay spaces as well, like GTA RP, where people just become way too invested in the story being told and seemingly forget that there are real human beings telling this story. And there's really nothing deeper to it than that. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough for this video. Let me know in the comment section down below your thoughts on consequences in Dungeons & Dragons and roleplay and Critical Role, as well as your thoughts from last night's episode of Critical Role Campaign 3, Episode 78. As well, please click one of the videos on screen now for more content. I highly recommend my deep dive into one of my favorite Halloween movies of all time, Monster House. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Drink your water, hug your mother. Until next time, peace of auto.